Hello, everyone. My name is Laura. I am the Marketing and Library Relations at Open Book Publishers, and I am really happy to present you today Jonathan Mallinson. Jonathan is Professor Emeritus of French at the University of Oxford, and he's also the author of a new exciting book that is called William Moorcroft Pottery, Individuality by Design. So Jonathan will very kindly have an interview with us today in which he will take us through the book, take us through the idea, who is William Moorcroft, why is his work important. So yeah, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you, Laura. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. William Moorcroft is probably one of the most celebrated potters of the first half of the 20th century. I think if anyone had asked a member of the public to name a potter in that period, his name would have been one of the ones I think that came to mind. He began his career at the end of the 19th century as a designer at a pottery firm in Stoke-on-Trent, where he worked until 1913, when his department at James McIntyre and Company was closed down, and he set up his own studio with financial support from Liberty of London. So he was already quite well connected there. And he continued in this studio of his own until his death in 1945. And the thing about Moorcroft's work, I think, is that it covers a very wide range. It was sought by museums the world over. It was retailed by some of the most prestigious shops the world over, Liberty of London, Tiffany's in New York, Rouard, an important sort of decorative arts gallery in Paris, in Russia, in Latin America, in Canada, all over in the colonies, Australia, South Africa as well. It won leading awards at international decorative arts fairs over a period of 30-odd years, beginning in 1904 and right up to the 1930s. He was winning the highest prizes. And he was awarded as well, which was a very odd thing for a potter. He was awarded a royal warrant by Queen Mary. And this again was part of his distinction. His work was admired by celebrities, political figures, art historians and critics, but also, and I think this is very important about him, by ordinary people as well. So he was catering really for a very broad range of market, the as it were, high-end, sophisticated art connoisseur type people, but also ordinary people. And this, I think, is because he was making both purely decorative items, artworks, examples of ceramic art, if you like, but also functional items you could have in your home and use, but also love. And I think that's a very important part. Now, what's unusual about him, as if this weren't unusual enough, is that he was admired in what might be thought of as quite distinct areas. So he was greatly admired as a potter, as somebody who understood what making pottery was all about. He developed a particular decorating technique, which was partly drawing on an old English tradition of slip decoration. Slip is the name given to liquid clay. And in the 17th century, slipware, English slipware, was a very distinctive form of pottery. And it was a bit like piping icing onto a cake. It was clay which was put into a sort of tube, I suppose, and then applied like a cake decoration. And he developed that and created with it, so his decoration wasn't simply drawn in this liquid clay, but he also developed a method of applying colour to the clay, because clay itself is not particularly colourful or particularly attractive. And he mixed most colour in pottery derives from metallic oxides, which when they're heated do all sorts of things which I don't fully understand in the heat and turn into colours. And the greater the heat in the kiln, the more likely it is that the colours will degrade. And what William Moorcroft did was to work out really how to mix the oxides and what conditions in the kiln were necessary to create really very beautiful colours. And instead of applying the colour to an already fired pot, it's what's called a biscuit pot. There are two principal firings in pottery. One is when you get the green clay, as it's called, and you put it in the kiln, and it is fired at a high temperature, and it hardens and becomes a lot less porous, because clay obviously is porous. And then you have you put your decoration on, or you may apply a glaze to that which really hardens it. It's like a glass film over the top, and then you might put your decoration on top of that. But what Moorcroft was doing was applying these these metallic oxides to the green clay, so it was very porous still, and it meant that the clay was being stained, and that gave a much greater depth of colour. It wasn't, as it were, superficial. When you put colour onto a glaze, it can actually wear off, and you often see pottery, where the colour has disappeared. But what was important about his technique was that the first firing of a pot is at a very high temperature, and the number of colours available when he began, which could withstand those high temperatures, was very low. And he developed his own colours. And so if you look at the way his art develops over 40 years, it begins really with a very restricted palette of greens and blues, and develops through the much more fragile or delicate colours of yellows and reds and so on, as he develops his skills as a potter. And all this was noticed at the time. But as well as that, as well as being praised as a potter, he was recognized really as a designer, as an artist. A lot of pottery at the time was basically an exercise in creating a kind of decoration which you applied to the surface of a pre-existing vessel, or where it was added. It was like an added extra. But what critics noticed about Moorcroft was that there was a very close relationship, an integrity almost, of decoration and form. And this was one of the things that was noticed right from the beginning. It didn't look like applied art or art applied to a vessel, but it was a kind of coherent object. And the third thing that he was famed for at the time, surprisingly, and this was in the 1930s, he was, when modernism, and particularly the influence of, as it were, a European aesthetic, a sort of functionalist aesthetic, was finding its way into England, in most cases very reluctantly, actually. I mean, the English were not noted for their, as it were, pro-European aesthetic sympathies. He designed tableware, which was highly praised by critics such as Niklaus Pevsner, who was one of the great proponents, really, of a European modernist aesthetic. Herbert Reed as well, another great critic, functionalist, formalist critic. And one set of tableware in particular, one set of designs, was known as powder blue, and it was a very simple, had very simple lines, and was decorated, had no ornament to it. It just had a sort of stippled blue decoration or colouring, really. And this was described by Pevsner as undatedly perfect. It was almost almost an iconic design, really, in the 30s. But what is so remarkable is that William Moorcroft introduced that design in 1914, not in 1935, when Pevsner was getting excited about it, but 20 years earlier. So he was all of these things, very separate things. And this, I think, is one of the oddities about him. I mean, it's both his strength, but in a sense, his weakness, because he doesn't fit into any categories.
Yes.
He isn't a designer because he made things, not personally, but we might come on to that later. He wasn't just a potter because he designed. He wasn't just an artist because he ran a studio. He employed people. He wasn't just an artist because he was making functional objects for ordinary people. And it means that he tends to get overlooked now. He doesn't appear in books on industrial designers. He doesn't appear in books on studio pottery. And when he does appear, it tends to be in books which focus on the Moorcroft potteries, which actually continues to make pottery today, and which, as it were, has developed out of his studio, but which obviously we live in different times. It's gone in its own direction. And William Moorcroft, in a sense, has paradoxically disappeared from view because he is so individual. And what I've tried to do in the book is to get a handle on that individuality and to look at him on his own terms and try to figure out, I suppose, what made him so popular, so acclaimed in his time.
That is absolutely wonderful. And actually that multifaceted nature that he had is a bit what you discuss in the book, as you said, like you put him in sort of liminal space in which he's currently not recognized or available in many different books from many different subjects to which he was actually part of. And that takes me to my second question, which is, like you mentioned, that it's interesting to have this book because it kind of like highlights Moorcroft as a person and as a designer and as an artist, the many phases that his work and his life had. But what is the main thing you would say, like why this book is important, why it needs to be out there, that perhaps other writings of Moorcroft have not covered? Or
Yeah, I think it's the first book really which has looked at William Moorcroft in his own time, on his own terms, in the context of what was going on around him, both aesthetically, commercially, socially, politically, at however general a level, but nevertheless to look at him in that context rather than in a more linear way. You know, this is the start of a larger history of what is thought of today as Moorcroft pottery. I'm interested in William Moorcroft, the potter who lived in the first half of the 20th century, and to look at what made him what he was. I think not made him how he may be seen now, but what made him what he was then. And what I've done in the book is to focus, I think, on different ways, I suppose, of getting a handle on this individuality. One of them is to look at the reception of his work at the time, the written reception of his work in reviews, in trade journals, in newspapers, magazines, and all the rest of it. And I think one of the things that's very striking is that critics at the time recognized that there was something about this work that was different. One critic said, Mr. Moorcroft's pottery is no ordinary pottery. And it's very striking that whereas if you read reviews of commercial pottery, should we say, they'll say such and such a firm has introduced a new design and give its name and perhaps describe the decoration and tell you what objects are made in this design, what colours, ways you can get, and all the rest of it. And it's very factual, very descriptive. When it gets to more reviews of William, I'll call him William's work, it's describing or trying to describe the effect that it has. Critics often say, I can't describe the colour. The vocabulary of colour, for instance, just doesn't cut it. It cannot convey, if you like, the sort of, I don't know, the iridescence of a lustre effect, or the, you know, this the sort of the depth, the richness of simply the colour effect. And then they start to talk about how it makes you feel to look at it, or indeed to touch it. Some clearly have picked it up and have enjoyed a kind of tactile experience. And there are a lot of metaphors of poetry, of fine art. He's likened to Whistler, for instance, and some critics, well, they talk about poetry, talk about trying to give concrete form to a sort of poetic inspiration that Moorcroft might have had. One critic talks about the poetry lifting the mind above the material. There's a kind of uplift, a kind of energy, I suppose. And often critics say, you know, they can't take their eyes off it. It is restful. Another, in the 1930s, his work is described as having a soulfulness. But this is a kind of vocabulary which is absolutely unprecedented in pottery that is not being made, if you like, in for an art gallery and so on. I mean, this is pottery that is made in larger quantities than that, not mass produced, but in larger quantities. And in some ways, it's quite similar to reviews that you find of some studio pottery being coming to prominence after the First World War in the 1920s and 30s. There are one or two individual potters who are working alone and creating works that are exhibited in art galleries and so on. And when critics talk about that work, there are overlaps, shall we say, with the kind of vocabulary that's used for William, even though the works themselves, there is all the difference in the world. You would never confuse a piece of studio pottery with a piece of William Moorcroft. They're completely different. Yeah. Starting with colour, I mean, studio pottery is not about colour. William Moorcroft's pottery, to a large extent, is about colour. So I've looked at reception. I've also looked, and this sort of follows on really from what we've just been saying, I've tried to situate this work in the context both of commercial pottery and studio pottery. And it's very striking that pottery manufacturers themselves thought William Moorcroft was different. They thought he was an artist, and they thought he was an artist because partly because of his decorative technique. I mean, what the technique I described is very labor intensive. Every piece is made individually, and equally in his designs, whereas a lot of commercial pottery, as it were, follows fashion. So you get what today is known as Art Deco. You get a lot of this sort of angularity, bright colours, strident, lively, sort of post-war jazz age colour. You get none of that. You get the influence of, sort of the mode for Egyptian wear after the discovery of Tutankhamun. You get all that sort of thing finding its way into commercial pottery design. You are hard pressed to find that sort of thing with William Moorcroft. His designs are based very much on aspects of nature. There are not sort of mimetic necessarily, but floral designs, landscape designs, fish sometimes, actually quite a few fish designs, which are, as I say, sort of integrated into the forms of the objects in different ways. So there are clear differences between the kind of thing he produces and the way he produces it from commercial pottery. But I look too at the emergence of studio pottery, the individual potter, where, as I say, there are all the differences in the world between his work and that of Bernard Leach or William State Murray or Reginald Wells. I mean, these were the principal names, I think, in the public eye in the 20s and 30s. But at the same time, and this is very interesting, I think, about William, is that he also has quite a lot in common with studio pottery. For all these differences, firstly, both he and studio potters insisted on hand production in everything. There was no molded ware. For mass production, really, in pottery requires an element of, as it were, mechanical aids. And one of the most common is using molds to create the object, the vessel, or whatever it is that's going to be decorated. The other form of mechanical aid is different tools or whatever for applying the decoration. You might use lithographs, you might use, as it were, spray paints, you might use any number of things, but everything for William Moorcroft is done by hand. And this is like a studio potter. You don't see a studio potter, turning a shape out of a mold. It's thrown, and everything that William made, with just a few exceptions, was thrown by a potter on a wheel. Not by Moorcroft himself, but the throw was part of his team. But more important even than that, I think, what they have in common is a disdain for commercial objects. That's to say, studio potters would never say, I'm in the business of making pottery because I want to make a living. They would say, I'm in the business of making pottery because I want to express myself, or I want to create something beautiful, or I like to work with clay. I can create, it brings out the creative in me. And this was true also of Moorcroft. He often speaks about the iniquities of objects made for profit, for commercial purposes. He wants to make beautiful objects. He's got often writes about almost the sanctity of clay, actually. This is the sort of primeval substance of creation. And it isn't just a kind of rhetorical flourish for him. I mean, it's something that he believes and writes about very genuinely, one feels. And that is a point of contact, I think, a point of similarity with studio pottery. So there's that. Now, the third thing I think that makes this book different is that I was very fortunate in being able to look at an archive of personal family papers that had been assembled by Moorcroft's daughter 50, 60 years ago, I suppose in the 70s, really, 50 years ago, which consist of a lot of papers that relate to Moorcroft's time at the firm of McIntyre, so when he was starting out his career, and then all the way through to his death in 1945. So there's a lot of material relating to his relationship with Liberty of London, who invested some money in the new studio factory that he was creating in 1913. And there are ledgers, there are, as it were, financial accounts, sales ledgers, which enable you to see really the extent of his commercial success. I've just said he had great disdain for objects made for commercial purposes. That is completely different from someone who didn't mind at all whether he sold his stuff or not. He was employing people. he knew he had to be a success. But what he didn't like and wouldn't do would be to make simply the stuff that would sell. He made what he believed in because he knew that other people, or he hoped, but he knew that other people would like it too. And if people like it, they buy it, and it's a virtuous circle. And that was a virtuous circle that he got onto. He didn't say, oh, I think there's a market for Art Deco or modern style. I'll do the same. He said, this is what I want to make. And this has got me in it, if you like. This is something I believe in. And the public recognized that. And that's very interesting. And crucially, it's brought out in another aspect of the archive material, which is a huge number of letters written to him by retailers, by individuals, by market or traveling salesmen, all the rest who were marketing his work on the road, as it were, traveling representatives, all of which testify to the impact that his work had. Individuals will write and say, I've just bought your vase and it's got pride of place in my home. Or there was a letter from Austin Reed, the tailors that I think they've now gone bust, but anyway, it doesn't matter. Austin Reed, the tailor, and the writer writes to Moorcroft and says, thank you very much for that vase that we commissioned for our new building in London. The only trouble I have with it is that I can't keep my eyes off it. I can't stop looking at it. So what this correspondence does is that it sort of it complements and it validates the kind of things that the reviews, which I was talking about earlier, were also saying. This is a very unusual kind of pottery that's being made, and it is striking a chord. And the other thing in the archive, which was so valuable, I think, were notebooks, diaries that Moorcroft had, or private correspondence, a wonderful correspondence with his daughter, in all of which, in little snippets, he talks about really what makes him tick, what he is trying to achieve in his pottery. And it absolutely clearly isn't, I want to make money. It is, I want to create something beautiful. I want to, as he says at one point, I want to express myself in clay. And that's what he does. And all these things, I think, taken together, build up a picture of a remarkable potter, and I think a remarkable man, actually. And the archive has never been examined before this.
This is the first time that
it is the first time it takes the form of probably just over 90 boxes of well, when I was looking at it, largely unassorted, definitely uncatalogued.
Oh my God.
Very dirty, sooty papers. Some of them in a rather advanced state of crumbling, and others not. And it was like, well, I felt like Howard Carter you know, I can see beautiful things when he looked and saw into Tutankhamun's tomb. It was like that, except it wasn't beautiful gold and lapis lazuli. It was cardboard and soot. But it was a wonderful, yeah, it was a wonderful moment.
That is absolutely fascinating. But one of the things that you've mentioned now that we've just been open to our viewers, we've had conversations before about Moorcroft, and it has a really important aspect to it, which is what you said before about, hey, this is being commercialized, and I do have a relationship with big retailers, big names in the retail world, but that's not my main objective. That's not my main focus. I want to create art for art's sake in that sense, and I want to feel proud of what I'm doing. I want to transmit what my thoughts, my design, and my feelings can put in this particular vessel, this particular piece. So that also, I believe, raised like really interesting questions about what is art, what is design, what is the line that separates what is considered like, or what could be considered Moorcroft as an artist or as a designer, and Moorcroft as the person who was, as you said, in charge of people, who had to employ people, take care of them, and also make sure that designs were in different places and retailers around the UK. So what questions do you think it has raised, Moorcroft as the figure, and Moorcroft as the pottery, and Moorcroft as the person in charge of that commercial venture as well, because that was another side of it?
Yes, I mean that's a huge question, and absolutely no, but a huge, but absolutely central, a central question, because in a way there is no way of drawing a distinction between those very distinct things that you've itemized when you're talking about William Moorcroft. That is what makes him, in a way, what he is. And part of that problematic, I suppose, or fascination is embedded. I mean, I sort of embedded it in the subtitle to the book, Individuality by Design. And it goes back, I suppose, to that opposition that I was talking about earlier between commercial pottery and studio pottery, or between a manufactured product and an individual product, something that is produced in more than one example, if you like, and something that is an individual piece, a one-off, or mass production, an individual. And what's interesting is, well, what's interesting is that at the time, I think Moorcroft unquestionably and explicitly was regarded as an artist. Whereas today, I think he tends to be seen much more as a manufacturer, because he has a factory and because that factory is still in operation. I forgot what I was going to say. Sorry. Interestingly, at the time, very early on, one critic said of him, William Moorcroft is a manufacturer, but he is also an artist. So already, I think, critics understood that there were the two sides. And what's nice about the word individual or individuality, which is constantly used in relation to Moorcroft's work, constantly. But what's nice about the word, apart from the fact that it, 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 means distinctive, is that etymologically, it means it cannot be divided. You can't, it's indivisible. And what he does is to bring together in a way that cannot anymore be separated out these different aspects. And I think one of the things that has interested me particularly is, well, partly why today he might not be considered in the same category as a ceramic artist, whereas in his own day, the question would never arise. And part of it, I think, is to do with the way that the pottery was made. I don't mean the technique necessarily, but I think there's a tendency to think of art as something which is the creation of a single person, as opposed to, I mean, you get jokes about don't get things designed by a committee or made by a committee because they look like, nothing on earth. And art is associated with something that originates in one person. Now, obviously, that is true of William Moorcroft's designs. I mean, he was the sole designer, and he designed both form and ornament and so on. But he didn't make them himself. And his method of production was much more collaborative than individual. So he obviously designed, he drew the design or the template for the design onto a kind of template object, and then it was traced by others and applied and so on. But he drew the first design. So he didn't simply work from a piece of paper and give it to someone and say, apply that to this shape, but he would present, if you like, the object with the outline of the design drawn on it, and would create the colours that were going to be then applied. But he didn't throw the pots himself. He didn't apply the liquid clay outline himself. He didn't apply the colour himself. He did, though, fire kilns for a particular glaze effect, flambe glazes, which was a kind of glaze which goes back to the ancient Chinese, and it was one of these things that potters in Stoke-on-Trent were trying to perfect, and different potters at the time developed in their own way equivalent glazes, and Moorcroft was one of those, and it was kept a very closely guarded secret, so he wouldn't tell anyone how to do it, but he did it himself. And there's one letter he writes to his daughter from the factory, or from his works. He never called it a factory, and he says, I'm feeling a little bit sleepy or lightheaded at the moment because of the gas. And what he'd been doing when you're creating the right kiln atmosphere for this glaze to work, at a certain point you've got to get the oxygen out of the kiln, and he used to do that by piping coal gas into the kiln.
Wow.
I mean, it was incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, I was going to say, no surprise that he was feeling lightheaded with that process.
And this is, I mean, it's a wonderful snapshot, if you like, of work, you know, the working potter. So, I mean, he was doing all that, but he didn't create the entire object with his own hands. It was a more collaborative form of production. But it was also, and I think this is particularly interesting, it was not just a collaborative method of production, but it was performative as well. That's to say, it begins with a design, a template, if you like, but I'll call it a design. And then it's made in series. There may be, how many, one doesn't know. Sometimes a pot may only be made 5 or 6 times. Sometimes it might be made 100, 200 times. It depends what it is. But each one of those objects is going to be different because it's made by hand, by different hands, in different circumstances, on different days. And it's like the performance of a piece of music. You look at go to 2 performances of the same bit of music, and it's not going to be the same. And it's made collaboratively. And I think of the way Moorcroft, if you like, creates art as being very similar to the way a performing musician creates art. He is like, well, Mozart wrote a lot of piano concertos, and when he performed them from the keyboard himself. He played the keyboard and he directed the orchestra from the keyboard. And Moorcroft is exactly the same. He's got an active role in this performance, but he's got other people performing with him. They are a team, and each of the objects is an individual object. They're not all going to be the same. And that, in a sense, is another way in which the subtitle, Individuality by Design, takes on a kind of meaning that there is, he's making objects for more than just a few connoisseurs, but for people out there. But he's making each one individual. And the thing is, he signed every piece, and he signed it by hand. It wasn't, it wasn't, even studio potters tended to have a little seal that they put on, a sort of mechanical thing. But William Moorcroft signed by hand. Not absolutely every piece, but certainly, I mean, he didn't sign a lot of his tableware, for instance, but 95% of his decorative work was signed by hand, by him.
Wow.
And it makes it individual. And what's remarkable, I think, is that this quality was not just evident in his museum pieces, but it was evident in his most modest pieces. And I thought it might be interesting. I've got an example.
That is so beautiful.
I don't know whether, can you see that?
Yes.
It's about 12 centimeters tall. I think it's really quite small. In the world of Moorcroft objects, this is really unremarkable. It's very simple. It's quite small. But it encapsulates, I think, what Moorcroft is about. to begin with, you could say, well, what is it? Is it a vase? Well, it is a vase. It's been used as a vase. You can tell, I mean, the sort of watermarks on the bottom and everything. But it doesn't have to be a functional object. It would work as a decorative object.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. And it works as a decorative object because you can see the way that the decoration, the ornament.
Could you move it a little bit further from the camera so that our viewers can see?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yes, that's great. Wonderful.
It's the design is, these are pomegranates and leaves and berries around. And you can see the way that the form of the pomegranates and the form of the belly of the vase sort of cohere, that the one, as it were, traces the outline of the other, and that too is mimicked in the berries as well, which takes that sort of circular motif into a slightly different dimension. And you've got the leaves that are gesturing round. So there's there's a movement, there's an impulsion to turn the object round. So it's a piece that is alive, if you like. It's got vitality. That was a word that was used to describe Moorcroft's work. It was a word used constantly to describe studio pottery, which is very different. But both of them have got this sense of life. But it doesn't stop there. Another thing, you can see probably just about the very faint white lines around the edges. That is the liquid clay, the slip, but it is incredibly fine. It's incredibly fine, and that is very skillful, believe me, to do it with that delicacy. When you see slip, normally because slip decoration is not in itself unusual, but normally the slip, it looks like I don't know, a sort of well, it looks like a barrier on a motorway, really. I mean, you know, not a thing is going to get over it. You know, it is applied as if it were a barrier. In the case of this, it is used as much decoratively as functionally. It's just very light. But the colours too, these are not flat colours. You won't necessarily be able to see it, but this pomegranate here, if I said, what colour is it? You might say, well, it's sort of a red, but beneath the red, there are shades of a sort of sandy colour, an ochre, which you get also at the top, which is ochre with a sort of dark blue or cobalt wash over the top. Now, the ochre layer is clay, and the pot will have been dipped into ochre stained liquid clay, and then the decoration applied on top. Now, that brings me to another thing about this pot. The pomegranate motif was very popular. It was one of Moorcroft's most long-lived motifs, most popular motifs, and he introduced it in 1910, just at this new reign of George the Fifth and Queen Mary, a new sort of era really opening, and he introduced pomegranate in the most luscious colours. There's a picture of one of the pots in these luscious colours in the book. And one of the features of early examples of this design were its ochre background, which is again a difficult color to pull off. Actually, in very hot conditions, it would degrade. This pot was made in 1917. It was made in the middle of the First World War. And what he has done is to put over the top, if you like, of what in happier times was associated with a new age full of hope, a dark shadow of cobalt, underneath which you can still half sense what was once there,
Yes.
as it were, just as you can in the pomegranates, that sort of richness, that luxuriance, that hope. But there is a kind of pall over this, and it's serious, it's somber, it's eloquent. One writer, a correspondent of Moorcroft, who was in fact the wife of the director of the V&A in London, somebody called Edith Harcourt Smith, wrote to Moorcroft just after the war, and she said, "You have no idea what pleasure you have brought with your art. Your pottery means so much in every sense." And I think what she was thinking of was something like that. It looks like, it's a very ordinary object, and yet it is eloquent. It is saying something, not in an obvious, let's write a message around it.
And the message is implicit.
Yeah, it needed to be read, but people did. People responded. People couldn't take their eyes off it. Okay. Right, I hope you can see
we
that.
We can see a little bit of the writing, although not in detail.
Yeah. Well, that green writing, that says W. Moorcroft, and that is his signature. And the significant thing, I think, is that even something as small and really quite unremarkable as that is given this kind of individual attention. It's like there was a famous retail firm years ago that had as its catchphrase, "exclusively for everyone." I don't know if you remember that. I can't remember who it was now, and I better not mention who it was, even if I remembered it. But it's that kind of idea that there's a desire to create something that is individual, but is not just for a few privileged connoisseurs. And that's the kind of art, I think, that William Moorcroft was wanting to create. I mean, it goes back to William Morris in a way, sort of to have what was called everyday art, if you like. And it doesn't just mean, oh, it's an attractive functional object, because actually there was an awful lot happening in these objects.
Yes.
And if you look at the objects themselves, which sort of circulate around now, a lot of them are damaged. And a lot of them are damaged because they were bought to be used.
Of course.
And loved and appreciated. And occasionally you find functional objects that are pristine. And those have never been used. And they've never been used because although they could have been used, whoever it was who owned them thought, it's too beautiful to use. I can't use it. I just want to look at it. And that's that is sort of collapsing that divide, if you like, between a work of art. I mean, you aren't going to use the Mona Lisa for something else. I mean, you just look at it. You aren't going to use an egg timer, you know, gaze at an egg timer. You're going to use it. But what William Moorcroft is doing is, if you like, collapsing that kind of distinction. And it's in a tradition, but he does it really very successfully.
And it's very unique in doing that, which is the reason why we're talking about how he creates this world in which you don't have to necessarily like draw a line between the two. You can just understand the whole work with them two merged together. That's really interesting. Yeah. So I was wondering, like, what do you think would be the main takeaway, let's say, like a key point that you'd like to read, like the readers to get from this book once they read it, when they've gone through it?
Well, there are probably quite a few, really. I mean, one is I'd love people to appreciate the pottery. I've been very lucky that you were prepared at OBP to allow quite a lot of illustrations, and a lot of the pots illustrated come from private collections, so they're not often seen in public. I was very lucky to be able to photograph them and just, as it were, bring out into the open some of these beautiful things. So it'd be nice to think that the art, because it isn't always easy to find Moorcroft's work in museums. I mean, you can do, but the range of his work is not that easy to track down. I'd like to think that it would change the way he was viewed, and he wasn't simply seen as a factory owner or the founder of a factory, but as an innovative artist. I'd like to think that the qualities of the man would come across too. The book isn't a biography. I didn't want to write, I don't think I'd have been able to write a biography, but the story of this potter, and it does follow a chronological course, is a story of great enterprise and courage and determination and self-belief and humility, actually. He was, what comes out, or one of the things that comes out, is the way he treated his staff. So, well, he never called them his staff, he called them his assistants or his co-workers, because, as we were saying earlier about collaboration, yes, that's how he saw it. It was his design, it was his brainchild, but he worked in a team. And in lots of ways, one of the things that comes from looking at the financial records in the archive was that whereas in the 20s, wages were falling as the economic conditions deteriorated and firms were struggling to make a profit, wages were being cut. You can see unequivocally from Moorcroft's wage books that he very rarely cut his staff's wages. And that must have been exceptional. I can't say it was unique because I don't know, but it can't have been common, because yes, all the journals had nothing else to talk about but wage cuts for workers and unemployment. And he did everything to keep his staff employed. the last thing I think that I think people will notice, I hope readers will notice about the book, is that the world that Moorcroft was living in was actually not very different from our world today. It was a world of, it was a world of pandemic, because the Spanish flu had raged since 1917, I think it started, and people were still worried about the flu in the late 20s. It was a world of economic depression. The stock market crash, the Wall Street crash of 1929, I think it was just one example of things very difficult for those in business. It was a world of social unrest. It was a world of political instability in Europe, I mean, in the 1930s. And in the midst of this, we've got a man who wouldn't simply say, well, I've got to make ends meet. What can I make that'll sell? How can I make it more cheaply? He didn't do that. He stuck to his principles. One critic said, "You have always ploughed a lone furrow." He was always determined to be himself. And his work was appreciated in France and Germany in the 1930s. In 1937, it was exhibited at an art museum in Munich, very prominently, and there's a letter written to Moorcroft that was then republished in the Times at the time, in which the museum in Munich, the Deutsches Museum, says, we are going to display your work prominently in our museum in 1937, at exactly the time that in Munich, about half a mile away, the National Socialist exhibition of degenerate art was on display. So at a time when art was being politicized, a museum in Germany recognized that there was nothing political about Moorcroft's pottery, but something that transcended national barriers. And they were making that point. And I think those qualities of I suppose you could call it integrity, and of truth to self, and the value of art in difficult times. I think that is as much a lesson for our times as it was for William Moorcroft's times. And I hope a reader might sort of pick that lesson up as well, probably from his life.
And I'm sure they will. I have a final question that is more of a personal one, but I wanted to ask you if you could describe in a few words how you felt when you first saw your first Moorcroft design or Moorcroft piece. Because you talk a lot about feelings and how Moorcroft made pieces that made you feel in, like, sort of get in touch with that design in itself. Did that happen to you at the time?
Yeah. Well, actually, with this one, that was the first piece of William Moorcroft I saw, and I thought it looked. I just thought it looked very beautiful and simple. And there was a little card in front that told me that it had been made in 1917. And I thought, oh, I can imagine that, because it's very somber. And, you know, you think, oh, that's a piece of history. That's where it starts. And then you you stop looking at it, if you like, and you hold it, and you can sort of feel that, you can feel the fact that it's been hand thrown. There's all the different, you can actually see the difference, I think. The more you look at pottery, the more evident it is when something has been molded as opposed to hand thrown. But this was very tactile. It sort of just fits in the hand, and you can imagine the hands of the thrower around it. And I was also struck by the signature on the bottom. I'd never seen that before. And later, I began to discover much more about, if you like, what else the pot was saying. I mean, its first impact, it's a bit like comedy in a way. I mean, this brings me more to the world I used to belong to of words. But the thing about comedy is that it works in two stages. The first stage is it amuses you, it makes you laugh. The second stage, if it's good comedy, is it'll start to make you think. You'll start to think, why did I find that funny? And there's a famous quotation that comedy is deadly serious. I mean, comedy is a very serious matter. And it's the same with Moorcroft Pottery. It begins with an immediacy, a visual click almost, that you see something and your brain, I think your brain often recognizes a kind of harmony, either because there's a sort of organic shape or because you recognize the harmony of decoration and form, or it may come through color. Colors strike you because of the way, they're juxtaposed, or the way they blend, or because they're unusual colors. But it's never anything strident. There's a kind of restfulness. And again, critics constantly talked about the restfulness of his work. But the more you look at it, the more, in a way, I mean, it's an odd metaphor, but the more it begins to speak to you.
Yes.
In different ways. I mean, that's the subject of a different book, I think, which would be very interesting, actually, to think about the way that objects can speak. But what I was saying about that pomegranate vase, I think, gives a taste of the way that color can be used as a means of expression.
Yes.
And the way that, allusions to earlier manifestations of the same design. People who talk about Moorcroft may say, oh, he used the pomegranate design a lot, almost implying that he didn't have a lot of imagination because he kept on coming back to the same motif. But actually, it isn't like that at all. I mean, it's like saying that, Hamlet is, you get a lot of Hamlet, but every performance of Hamlet over the ages is going to be different.
Yes.
And you're seeing it for the first time. And that's one of his, one of the ways I think his art works is that sort of self-referential dimension.
That is that is absolutely beautiful. Really, nice to see, as you said, the many approaches that just a single piece can give you over time, and how you can see how it evolves in your own mind and your own perception of it, and how you interpret it from the first view of hey, this is a beautiful piece, I really like it too. What is the meaning behind this color? What is the meaning behind this lines? What is the meaning behind this particular design? So yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. And those were all my questions. So yeah, thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure to have you, and I'm really, really happy that we had this interview. And I'm sure our readers will be really glad to go through the different like aspects of the book and different aspects of Moorcroft as a person. So yeah, I can't say anything else than like thank you. And yeah, so I hope everyone reads the book and read them a lot and learn a lot about Moorcroft. It's a really interesting individual, as we said in the book.
Well, thank you, Laura. It's been a great pleasure, and I'm delighted. Thank you.
For everyone who's watching, so the book is an open access title, so it is available to read and download for free, and I will put the link in the description box below so you don't have to go to the website and just click, and the book will be there for you. Thank you so much again, Jonathan.
Thank you, Laura. Bye.